Hello everyone, it's been a while since the last time that we actually talked about any of the modern censorship issues that have been going on in Japan. Part of me really just stopped doing that for a while because of the fact that I realized that much bigger channels as well as people out on social media were already doing it and starting to catch on and report and all of that. So there really wasn't as much of a reason for me to do it, right? My work was kind of done. However, with the recent thing that's been going on with Fantia, I realized it would seem like a lot of misunderstanding that is still going on about what the actual issue is that's happening this time around. And at the very least, the reasons why people outside of Japan are up in arms over the situation and the way directions to which their energy is being channeled is very different from where people in Japan are looking at the issue. And so I wanted to make this video to make it clear so that people outside of Japan can also understand the bigger issues at hand with this specific scenario, because it's not so much a credit card payment processor issue like many of the other previous ones. Rather, it has to do more with the vagueness of some of the laws that have existed in Japan for a very long time, and they are actually causing this issue now to look a lot worse and become a lot worse than it could otherwise have been if not for this laws. So for those of you who do not know what's happening, Fantia is basically a Patreon-like service, basically a site where you can go on and support your favorite creators and give them money to continue to do what they do, except it's largely used within Japan specifically for doujin creation spaces, both whether you're making real life cosplay or adult content or just drawing something in particular. It's a service that is run by the same company that basically now is the parent company of Tora no Ana, which is one of what used to be one of the bigger doujin book sales sites within Japan prior to the pandemic at least. So the origin of this incident was actually not the 19th of May but the 15th, when Fantia initially put out a notice stating that they were having to change some of the ways that mosaic was being used on the content on their website. Because for those of you who do not know, within Japan, for adult content, if you're going to show the parts of the body that are more sexual in nature, you need to actually put a mosaic over it to basically prevent it from harming the minds of minors, even though arguably this content is all restricted for minors in the first place. It's a very silly thing. We'll get more into that later on. But basically, initially what they had done was that all of this was something that they had put out as a request to appeal to creators to apply. But on the 19th, this was actually changed into a whole complete guideline change instead of just a request for compliance. On the 20th, they basically made an announcement then that this would come into effect on the 25th. And the thing is, were it just a change for works that you were going to upload to the site from that point onwards, it probably wouldn't have been that big of an issue even within Japan, because of the fact that, the issue with a lot of this mosaic and things like that is that it has always been very vague. And the use of mosaics in censorship in Japan is something that has existed since even before the 80s. So it's nothing really new. The big issue is that they actually announced that this would also retroactively apply to all content that you have uploaded on the site till that point. So if you were someone who has been making content for decades at this point, because people may have been making doujin content since the 90s for that matter, and they may have just decided one day to put all of this content onto Fantia, you would then have to re-censor all of that content using the new censor guidelines instead. And the issue is that, as you can imagine, that's a very short span of time to go back and retroactively deal with all potential content. And to make matters worse is the fact that if one did not comply with this, Fantia basically put out there that they were going to take the following actions, where firstly, content that infringes on this will first be hidden or potentially removed while a request to edit the content is made. If that is not actually complied with, and the account itself may actually be frozen or closed, and if they detect or believe that there is malice behind this, they may actually turn this content over to the police along with all logs and data that may be necessary for the police to take action. At present time, as of May 20th at around 1:30 p.m, Fantia then put up an update on Twitter, which they actually posted to clarify some of the questions people had with the situation. The first of which was them mentioning that the implementation of the mosaic in the form that they're requesting is not to make the website more strict than other websites that exist, but to basically bring them up to the industry standards for what the mosaic should be, and that they won't ban anyone outright for non-compliance, but instead they will first send notifications to creators to fix the issue, and only if that isn't complied with that they would actually start to take any form of action, which led to the bigger issue, which was the fact that this Q&A and clarification that they put out just completely conflicted with some of the information on the website, because of the fact that on the website it did say that you may get instantaneously banned and frozen as well. So people are very confused as to what was happening because of all of the fact that this is all a lot of very chaotically disseminated information, because of the fact that all of the messaging right now is just all over the place. And on top of that, they didn't actually give a guideline on what the mosaic should actually look like as a result, because while they did say that the level of blurriness for blur and like pixel mosaics have to be obvious enough for the thing being hidden behind it to be not visible, as you can imagine, that's fairly vague, right? Like, how far does one have to go before it's considered discernible is something that they did not mention, and that's a problem because other websites typically do actually tell the users how far you need to pixelize something for it to be okay on the website. But in spite of the fact that they did not mention how strict this needs to be, Fantia even went on to say that they might just outright ban an account for it, which is part of why there's a lot of unhappiness within Japan about this, because of the fact that it's very vague and there isn't really a good way for creators to actually deal with the problem at hand. Basically, just to make it clear to people who are wondering about this situation, no, the company isn't removing content of a certain type from the website. They're not saying that specific types of content are impermissible. Rather, all of the types of content that already have some level of censorship mosaic on them need to strengthen the mosaic or censorship that exists on those specific situations where they already exist. Needless to say, we can't say that they won't make things even stricter in the future, but we'll have to get there. We have to deal with that when we get there. But that said, obviously, there are many things that could have been improved with the situation, because honestly, it is quite bad that they only gave people 7 days to deal with a potential backlog of decades of content that they have to rework. So all of this is very messy, and it feels very unprofessional that they actually had this on such a short timeline, and that is part of what is setting people off of the situation as well, where people are wondering if someone is putting pressure on the company to actually do all of these things. However, at the same time, I feel like, especially for people overseas who seem to be looking at this situation, a lot of them are misunderstanding the core of the issue at hand and are getting up in arms at the wrong things that actually may have no bearing on the situation at hand, because even if we get angry at these specific things, there is a more deep-rooted issue that just exists that is causing this whole situation in the first place. Because I get that it's a very big concern, you know, that people's accounts can get banned and frozen without any notice, that the police can be called on them for all of the situations. But you have to remember that the only reason why this can even happen in the first place, that the police can be called on them on something as small as it may sound like as a mosaic on a piece of work, is because of the vagueness of the law that exists in Japan in regards to all of this. Because while it's very easy to look at the entire situation and say that like, oh, but you know, they shouldn't be able to go to the police on all of this kind of things, it's also true that with some content on the website, you kind of want them to be able to do that as well, right? If someone were to post actual like physical adult content about a real existing human child, that is very bad, and we would want the website to be able to stop that kind of content from going up, and to be able to turn the content as well as the person putting that kind of content up to the authorities to deal with, right? The issue is not so much that they have the ability to do this, but the fact that it is being applied to things that seem like very minor infractions. Even if you believe that some organization, some activist group, or the credit card companies are behind all of this, fact of the matter is, this would not have devolved to this extent if not for the laws within Japan that exist that allow it to reach this point as well, right? There is a deeper and bigger issue at hand in this specific situation that doesn't really exist in some of the other situations we've talked about before. Because what we are looking at now basically stems from what is considered Penal Code or Criminal Code 175 within Japan. This has been enforced since 1951, and its predecessor has actually existed since 1907. So we're talking about things that have existed before World War I, if you want to go very deep into it. And if you wanted to look at it from a more like modern level, the law or the code as it stands now had begun to exist post-World War II. So it has been around for a long time. This may not be anything new. However, the problem with Penal Code 175, which deals with the distribution of obscene objects, is that it is extremely vague. Basically, if something is considered to be obscene, it is technically illegal in this country. But then that leads to the question of, well, what is considered obscene? Because that is a very vague term on its own, right? And the big issue there at hand lies with the fact that the whole of this penal code and the way it is applied is very much on a case-by-case vibe basis, wherein if something is considered to be art, it may or may not count as obscene. May or may not. It depends on what is considered to be the public perception at the the time. So if it is publicly seen as obscene, then even if it is art, it's not allowed. As you can imagine, that is very vague. So you then might wonder, well, then why has Japan has been able to be fine with all of this adult content, the doujin, the live action stuff as well all this time? Well, that's all because of the fact that the interpretation of what is considered obscene for a long time has been taken from the customs law, where the customs law has basically stated that something is considered obscene if the parts in question are physically visible on screen. So if the parts themselves, you can see them on screen and you can make them out, then technically it is illegal under the penal code or the criminal code. And as you can imagine, because of the fact that in the customs law it has been defined like this, people kind of realize that all you really have to do to not infringe on that specific law is to, put a pixel or a black bar, depending on which part of what kind of kink you have, over the parts that are considered problematic, and you can kind of get around this issue, and that's why it has continued to flourish, but except in the somewhat different way that it has across all these years. So the issue at hand is not that a new form of restriction has come up in this situation, but rather the laws that exist are so vague that basically people are having an issue with how they can even represent their work, because the levels to which this censorship needs to be put in place is up to the interpretations of whoever is trying to deal with this at this point in time. And the issue of this is also the fact that what counts as like the industry standards is also very vague and doesn't really serve as a good guiding point for the most part, because in the end, like with visual novels, for example, you have the sovereign, which kind of exists to basically ensure that companies do the pixelization the right way, as well as ensure that they are rated at the appropriate age levels, as well as what kind of content can and cannot be within adult-oriented games within Japan. Most of that is basically just the industry itself coming together to put restrictions on itself in hopes that the government will not clamp down further, in that they hope that by showing that the industry is willing to regulate itself, that the government does not have to intervene with even stricter regulations. And the issue of this is obviously the fact that, if the government for some reason just decides that their stricter interpretation is the right interpretation, then there isn't really as much that the industry can even do to push back against it. It really just exists in a space where they try to prevent any action before it even comes, but if it does come, there isn't really any form of like fighting that they can do to actually stop this from happening either. And we have seen this across multiple industries in many different ways, be it in the gacha game industry, where the regulations on what they can and cannot do have just changed over time in spite of the fact that they have suggestions and guidelines on what can be done. And the same has been the case for the visual novel with the sovereign as well. All this to basically say that the situation is not good. It's not good either way, but the reason why it's not good is not because of the usual suspects that people might be thinking of and have been talking about on social media to some extent, but rather what is happening now, and the thing that people in Japan are getting more angry at is specifically this Penal Code 175 instead, because this code is what leads to this very vague law that allows the government to basically clamp down more on these types of content. And because of how vague the law in and of itself is, it can then be used potentially for things such as clamping down even more on the types of freedom of expression that people have when creating this kind of content as well. So that is the bigger issue at hand in this specific situation. And I get what some people might think, like, oh, it's just adult content, it's a sushi thing, I don't care about any of that. But once again, all of this goes back to the whole issue of freedom of expression, right? People who are adults should be allowed to consume the types of content that they want, especially in the world of fiction, where the things that you enjoy do not tie back to real life, and the average human should have enough common sense to understand to not replicate the degenerate stuff they enjoy in real life either. And the usual concept also applies because of how vague this law actually is. It could potentially go on to hit things on a much bigger spectrum as well in the future, because in the end, it just deals a lot with what is considered obscene, and that's a very vague word in and of itself. Even in Japanese, when it uses waisetsu, what counts within it can be very vague, and this could then be used to then clamp down on things that may not initially seem like the kind of thing that you may not like in terms of your own sexual proclivities, or it might even go outside outside of the realm of what is sexual towards things that are even horror or gore based as well, because you could interpret that as some sicko somewhere is like getting some form of like sick sexual pleasure out of that. So a lot of this is so vague that it is actually an issue in and of itself, and it makes the whole idea of freedom of expression in Japan a lot more difficult because of the fact that a lot of this is in such a gray area that people don't really know what they can express to begin with. People might think that like, oh, but Japan is one of the bastions of freedom of expression when it comes to adult content. It's kinda true, but not really, in the sense that legally it has always been just up in the air, like kind of like many things in this country, you know. They just kind of leave it in a gray zone where nobody wants to touch it, and like when things actually happen, it kind of gets bad as a result. But yeah, you know, basically there's no point in brigading Fantia. There's no point in like directing the anger towards them, because in this specific case, it would seem that there is legal pressure being applied on them using this vague law that has persisted in this country for a very long time. So that there really isn't anything they can push back. This is not a case of like, oh, we can just change our credit card supplier and we'll be fine. This is one of those cases where like, no, if they get hit by whatever like group is trying to push this at a legal level, the company itself could be considered like criminal for actually abating and allowing for what is considered obscene materials in the country under the criminal code, which is another thing that we'll probably need to see going forward as well. Because if Fantia is saying that they are doing this to keep up with industry standard, and you know, arguably some of it is already stricter than what other competitors in the industry are doing, it may mean that there may be a trend in the future of this getting worse. So that is worth looking at as well and watching out for. But yeah, for those who are wondering what is going on with the situation, this is basically a big part of it, and it's part of why many people in Japan actually feel that like Criminal Code 175 should be repealed, because some of it just really doesn't make sense with how vague it is. Or, you know, if you're gonna keep it there, it should kind of be more well defined as to what it actually refers to and to what capacity, so that people can continue to create content and maintain their livelihoods without having to worry about all of this as well. But yeah, that's it. That's all I have for you guys for today. Thank you all for watching. I just wanted to get this out there in case it is not very obvious, since, you know, a lot of this, especially with the legal side of it, gets lost within Japan because of how old many of these laws are. You know, if you're interested, I actually have a video about the types of laws and regulations and when they got implemented within the visual novel industry as well. So like you can actually get a sense that a lot of these things have been coming in like 30-40 years ago, and the impression that people have may not be the most accurate when it comes to how free the freedom of expression in Japan actually is. And I'll actually be doing more videos in the future talking about how grey the legality of like doujin content in general actually is, in spite of the fact that it blossoms the way it is, and I'm happy that it does as well. But that's it. That's all I have for you guys for today. So until next time, take care and bye-bye.